Hey everyone, welcome back to the Maya Learning Channel, and today I'd like to talk to you about something very special, the Bifrost Graph. Now, some of you might already be familiar with Bifrost Fluids, Maya's signature FX platform. That's not what I'm talking about today. Though the two have a shared history, hence the similar names, the Bifrost Graph is a brand new plugin that supports Maya 2018, 2019, and onward. It's a portable, visual, node-based way to design, build, and test custom behavior that includes effects, but with the potential for much, much more. However, before getting into all that, it'd be best to go over the basics first. Before we begin, it's always a good idea to make sure the Bifrost plugin is loaded up here in the Plugin Manager. Now, like I said before, the Bifrost Graph is a node-based system. A node graph, for those who might not know, is a series of individual pieces, called nodes, that move and manipulate information from one scene element to another. Maya has a few ways to view and edit these, like the node editor up here, or the hypershade for shading networks. For example, an object's shape node might feed its faces into a shading group node, which then colors those faces using the appropriate shading graph. For a more detailed primer on node graph basics, click the link at the top of your screen. Starting from the node editor, the workflow to view and edit a Bifrost graph is similar to viewing and editing a shader. At a high level, each is represented as a single node, but both also have their own editors for digging into them in more detail. To create a new Bifrost graph, just go up to Create Bifrost Graph. As expected, this creates a new Bifrost Graph node and opens the Bifrost Graph editor. Now remember, although the Bifrost Graph editor and the node editor look kind of similar, they aren't the same. In the node editor, a Bifrost graph is represented by a single node. This shows you how the graph plugs into the rest of your scene. However, to actually work inside the graph node, I need to use the Bifrost Graph editor. As you can see, a default graph doesn't consist of much, just an input node representing values coming in from the DAG, and an output node representing values going back out. In order for the graph to display anything in Maya, something needs to be hooked up to this output node. However, dragging a wire between the input and output doesn't do anything notable, since I'm just passing empty data through, in one ear and out the other, as it were. So instead, let's try inputting this sphere into the graph. I'll start by turning on shapes in the outliner. Then middle drag the sphere's shape into the graph. This creates an appropriately named second input node, which I can try plugging into a new output. So that definitely did something. Now I can see a BIF node in the outliner. This is a Bifrost object, which is the eventual output of all Bifrost graphs. Notice that it's made of a transform and a shape, just like any other object in Maya. So, if I just move this transform node to the side, now there's two spheres. Well, more accurately, there's my original sphere and my Bifrost output. Likewise, the node editor reinforces what I'm seeing by showing the Bifrost graph's output feeding the BIF object's shape. But the graph isn't doing anything more than spitting out exactly what it's taking in. So let's do some stuff in the Bifrost graph to actually change our output. First, I'll dock the Bifrost graph editor to make it easier to work with. Now, to create a new node, I'll just hit the Tab key, exactly the same as the node editor. This brings up a list of various nodes organized by category. I can either select one or refine my search in this text box. I'm going to start with a simple setGeoProperty node. As the name implies, this node sets various properties on whatever it's plugged into. There's a number of different input and output plugs here. To get a sense of what each of them are for, I can always go to the Info tab here on the right. This is your go-to spot for help on each node, so use it frequently. I first need to input an object I want to change properties on, aka my sphere. So I'll just drag a wire from here to here. Next, I need to choose a property to modify. In this case, I'll change its color. Then finally, I'll need to output the result, which I'll do on a new input port, just so I can compare the results. As you can see, this created another BIF object, which I'll also translate over to the side. Now, theoretically, once I've turned texture shading on, I should be able to change the second sphere's color just by tweaking this data field. But I can't. That's because this field is only a single number. Colors are represented by 3, a red, green, and blue value, also known as RGB. To get something like that, I'll hit Tab again and create a value node. Now, a value node defaults to float, or decimals, but I can use it to store any type of value just by clicking this button next to type. In this case, I'm going to store a 3-component vector. This gives me my 3 values. Now I'll wire this up to the data port. And now if I play with my 3 values, the sphere changes colors. While this is cool, it's kinda awkward to have to constantly return to the Bifrost graph just to change a few colors. So instead, let's wire the value node back to the outside by dragging it to a new port on the input. Then I'll right-click to rename it Color Value In. Now if I select the Bifrost graph in the outliner, you can see that those values have been exposed in both the attribute editor and channel box. This is pretty handy because now I can do something like create a locator, then connect its translate values to these color values. Which then allows me to change color just by moving it around the scene. Congratulations, you just built your first functional Bifrost graph. Of course, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Let's see where we can go from here. First, I'll select the value and set geoproperty nodes, then hit Ctrl-G to group them. This combines them into a compound with its own input and output ports, essentially a mini Bifrost graph within a Bifrost graph. Double-clicking it will dive inside, where I can see it has its own setup of nodes with inputs and outputs. To arrange them nicely, I can just press L. Once I'm done, the breadcrumb up here lets me return to the root level. Then I'll click the compound's title and rename it Change Color. Now that my color changing compound is portable, I can add whatever object I want, then swap it into the compound. If I ever want to know what kind of information a wire is carrying, I can right-click it to create a watch point. This is a great debugging tool that allows me to compare and contrast info. For example, this one shows me the info coming out of my change color compound. Let's compare that to the wire that's bypassing the compound. Notice that one clearly has a color property while the other does not. Just note that watch points only work properly when connected to an active output. If nothing was being fed through the output, like if I disconnected it on the other end, then the watch point would cease to work as well. Just something to keep in mind. Finally, what would a Bifrost tutorial be if we didn't simulate something dynamic? To import a basic simulation, you can simply search for basic in the node creation window. For now, I'll create a basic particle graph. I'll cover aero and combustion in later videos. This imports as another compound, except this one doesn't have any plugs on input or output. To use it, I need to right-click and either make it editable or explode it, which brings its contents into the root. This is how I recommend working because making direct connections is faster and easier than constantly working through a compound's input and output. And you always have the option to regroup them into a compound again later. Now I'll wire my sphere up to the emitter and the outgoing particles to a new output. And after a few seconds, we get instant particles. I can adjust the settings in each of these nodes to change the way the particles act, or add influences like turbulence and wind, or colliders like my cube. Then when I'm done, I can recombine them into a new compound called emit particles. I can even right-click to create custom background descriptions. Or take the output of my particles and plug it into my change color compound. Then I can animate the locator to get a strobing effect. Again, this ability to mix and match nodes, swap inputs and outputs, and reuse compounds is what makes Bifrost so powerful. And once you're comfortable with the ins and outs of navigating the graph, I recommend opening the Bifrost browser for some examples of more complex effects. Just drag one of these into the graph to import it into your scene. Then you can test it out and explore its connections to dissect how it works. Or just stay tuned to the Maya Learning channel, where I'll be doing plenty of my own Bifrost breakdowns too.